And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I'm your host, Demo, and this is 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks, Episode 7. Starting off this week, Orcish Squatters. This is a real funny one, you know. I always like to mention cards that have very unique abilities. So even if there's not a specific deck they can go in, or if they're not really that powerful, any card that has a very unique ability, I think is worth mentioning, because there's always going to be someone who's like, oh, that goes great in my, fill in the blank deck. So when Orcish Squatters attacks and isn't blocked, you gain control of target land defending player controls for as long as you control Orcish Squatters. If you do, Orcish Squatters assigns no combat damage this turn. So first of all, I love the art. I love the name. They're squatters, right? They're squatting on someone else's land. It's just great. Everything about this card is kind of funny and unique. And it is just a very unique card. Gaining control of lands in red. You just don't see that very often. I think I had this in a Sidar Kondo deck back in the day because Sidar lets your Orcish Squatters be unblockable, essentially. So just a card to think of if you're making a deck like that. Next up, Orcish Lumberjack. This is a great one for ramping. So you're going to tap it, sacrifice a forest, add 3 mana in any combination of red and or green. Great card for ramping. I mean, it's essentially a dark ritual in red or green. I mean, obviously you have to be playing both, right? You need forests and you also need to be in red in order to play this. So it has to be in a Gruul deck or a deck that at least has red and green. This card I have in my Klothys deck, my CEDH Klothys deck, because quick ramping, ritual type effects are really important in CEDH. I think I've seen other people play it in CDH as well, but even in any deck, especially in a lands deck, if you're in Gruul, Lord Windgrace comes to mind, and you're sacrificing lands anyway and putting them in your graveyard, it seems great in a deck like that. Next up, One with Nature. This is an Aura enchant creature, only 1 mana. And when enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped. Now, I know green is already great at ramping, but this just seems like such a good one. I have this in my Questing Beast deck. My Questing Beast deck is attacking a lot. So, I thought this would be a great card for that. I also have lots of death touch creatures in that deck, so me connecting with opponents is common. Yes, green does ramp really well already, but if you have any creatures that are going to be attacking and connecting every turn, it doesn't get much better than 1 mana and put a land into play tapped every single turn. Next up, Orum's Thunder. So this is another card that used to get played a lot in Commander back in the day, and I haven't seen it in years. Again, it got printed in Commander 2015 because it was getting played in Commander back then. So when I first started playing, and I think I started playing around this time, this card was seen a lot, right? So you're going to pay 3 to destroy target artifact or enchantment. If it was kicked, so if you play 4, and obviously you have to play this in a deck that's red and white, it deals damage equal to the permanent's converted mana cost to target creature. So this can be really good. This can be I kill an artifact or enchantment and also kill a creature. That can be so good. I just think that maybe it's been pushed out, like Wear Tear I tend to put in my Boros decks over this. White and red both have lots of creature removal, so maybe that's why. But it's just another great option. Again, for any new players who haven't seen this card before, it's really great in Commander if you can find room for it. Next up, Obliette. So this got reprinted in Double Masters, and it's a very unique card. It's been errated big time, right? The original card has and I'm not even going to read the text, but it's super complicated and bizarre. The errated text, and maybe that's why they reprinted this card. So this is just an enchantment, and when Obliette enters the battlefield, target creature phases out until Obliette leaves the battlefield. Tap that creature as it phases in this way. So why is this important? Why is this significant? All right. Essentially, it's an Oblivion Ring, right? Why not just use Oblivion Ring? It can hit any permanent. The reason why this is important is because it can lock out somebody's commander, okay? If someone Oblivion Rings your commander, it goes to exile, and then they can choose to put it in the command zone. This just phases out their commander, right? If you put this into play, you can phase out your opponent's commander, and it's stuck there, right? Phasing a commander out doesn't allow you to move it to the command zone. That's why this card is significant in Commander. Next up, Overburden. This is kind of a nasty one. Another card that I saw quite a bit back in the day. It doesn't get played as much anymore. I see it sometimes in Tatiova decks. So it's 2 Man Enchantment. Whenever a player puts a non-token creature onto the battlefield, that player returns a land they control to owner's hand. So it is kind of a stacksy card. You know, you could put this in, say, my Cosima deck that I did. You could put it in a deck like that where you're okay with returning lands to your hand. And Baron is another one that comes to mind. Where this works great is a deck where you either want to be returning things to your hand or you are making lots of land drops. So a landfall deck in blue, again, you don't see that much. Cosima is one of those cards that does this. It's definitely a card that if you play, you know, and I do cover these cards, even though these are cards, and I don't play cards like this. I didn't put this in my Cosima deck for that reason, but I do cover cards that people might be interested in, whether I like them or not. I don't want to play against this card, but some people might find it can be really good in a Tatiova deck or any deck where you're making lots of landfalls and are also in blue. And it really can screw your opponents over. Speaking of blue and landfall triggers, I came across this card and I just thought, man, this would be perfect in my Cosima deck because it just gets you those landfall triggers, right? So it's an enchantment. You can remove a counter from Parallax Tide to exile a land. And typically you would use this on your opponent. I actually think this was in a World Championship deck because you would just exile your opponent's lands and it would just sort of slow them down. I wouldn't use this card like that though. Again, I put this in my Cosima deck because it gives you landfall triggers. You exile all your lands, right? And what you can just do is you can play this and then wait until the end step before your turn and remove all 5 counters, right? Because you can do them all at once. Exile 5 of your own lands. And obviously you want your Cosima. If you're playing a Cosima deck, you want your Cosima in exile. Then when it comes around to your turn, the fading triggers and it says, okay, well, there's no counters on it, so we're going to sacrifice it. And when Parallax Tide leaves the battlefield, each player returns to the battlefield all cards they own exiled with it. So all your 5 lands come into play all at the same time, and you get 5 landfall triggers, all just like that. Also, not that a Tatiova deck needs any help, but also good in a Tatiova deck because you're going to draw 5 cards and gain 5 life. And then Parallax Wave, again, same thing, except this time you're doing it with creatures. I've put this in a couple of decks where I want ETBs, right? I had this in a couple of my ETB decks that had white. Same exact scenario, right? You're going to exile those ETB creatures and then they come back. You can use this on your opponents too if you want, right? You can just exile your opponent's creatures if you temporarily need to. You know, a lot of people will put Parallax Wave in their Atraxa deck, and what they'll do is they'll exile some creatures, and then because they can keep proliferating and putting those fading counters back on their Parallax Wave, those creatures that they've exiled never end up coming back because the Parallax Wave doesn't go away. You know, you can do that. I like this better as a, you know, maybe in a rune deck or any deck where you are doing a lot of blinking. You can just exile 5 of your creatures and then they all come back and you get all those ETB triggers right away. Paradigm Shift. So this is a funny one, you know, and again, I don't know exactly where you use this. It just has such a unique effect that someone will go, hey, that works great in my whatever deck, right? So just 2 mana, exile all cards from your library, then shuffle your graveyard into your library. That is a very unique and very powerful effect. Off the top of my head, I don't know where you play this, okay? But exiling your library and then shuffling your graveyard into your library is very powerful. You can use this as sort of a doomsday type effect where you have like maybe 3 cards in your graveyard and you cast this and it just, those 3 cards in your graveyard become your library, so you know exactly what you're going to draw. Maybe you could even put a Thassa's Oracle in your graveyard, draw that, play it and win. I don't know. You know, it's just a card that has such a unique and powerful ability, somebody might find a place to use it. And finally today, Parallel Thoughts. So this is another one, sort of like, you know, Mangaro's Tome that I mentioned in the last one, where I just think being able to search your library for a large number of cards all at once is really, really powerful, right? We all know Tutoring is super powerful in Commander. So it's a 5 mana enchantment. When Parallel Thoughts enters the battlefield, search your library for 7 cards, exile them in a face down pile, and shuffle that pile again. So just like with Mangaro's Tome, you're shuffling that pile so you don't know what you would get, right? If you would draw a card, you may instead put the top card of the pile you exiled into your hand. So again, just like with Mangara's Tome, except this time you don't have to pay the mana, right? So this time you can just wheel, right? You can just wheel and get all 7 of these cards into your hand. So maybe this is even better than Mangara's Tome, you know, I guess. And again, there are certain situations where this could be great. I had a lot of people in the last video say, hey, Mangara's Tome works great with this and Mangara's Tome works great with that. It's really good if you want to be doing a very specific thing. So for example, my Atraxa Sagas deck that I just made, you know, I can go get, because I don't have a ton of sagas in that deck, I can go get 7 sagas and exile them. And instead of drawing a card, I guarantee myself getting a saga. I don't know which one I'm going to get, but I am guaranteeing that I get one. You know, someone had said about Mangara's Tome to put it in a landfall deck so you can guaranteed get yourself a land. So with Parallel Thoughts, maybe you can do this. We're really on a landfall theme with the blue landfall. If anyone wants to make a blue landfall deck, there's lots of ideas here. So Parallel Thoughts, you go get 7 lands out of your deck. If it gets destroyed and you don't get access to those cards, it's not a big deal. But if you want to guarantee yourself a land, you can just, you know, replace your draw and put a land in your hand. You know what you're getting because you just exiled 7 lands, right? So there's a lot of ways you can use this card. That's what these lists are all about. Just suggesting cards, whether you like them or not, that people might want to use in their decks. That is it for today. I do have a Patreon now. If you feel like supporting the channel, if you like the content, I'm putting the link in the description below. And thanks for tuning in.